The morning Nora Calloway's bank account showed $3.47. She was already in her wheelchair, already dressed, already pretending. That was the thing no one understood about ruin. It didn't announce itself the way catastrophe did. It arrived quietly, through a phone screen, while the coffee was still hot and the house still looked like hers. $3. The company she had built from a converted garage in Portland was gone. Not failing, gone. And the man she had trusted with every number, every account, every financial wire since the beginning had made sure of it. The brass door knocker on her front door had been ringing for 4 minutes before she let herself hear it. She almost didn't answer. She had stopped answering things. What happened in that doorway, what walked in when she finally opened it, would cost her the last walls she still believed in. If you're already feeling this one, leave a heart in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. The ruin had taken 3 months and one person to accomplish. That was the part Nora kept returning to. In those first weeks after the accounts were frozen and the offices were locked and the lawyers stopped calling because there was nothing left to litigate with. 3 months. She had built Callaway Systems over 11 years, starting with a second monitor she couldn't afford, and a logistics algorithm she rewrote 4 times before it worked. She had grown it into a company with 214 employees and contracts with 3 regional hospital networks and a reputation in the Pacific Northwest supply chain sector that people did not easily dismiss. She had done all of that from a wheelchair, which was not the remarkable part, though people consistently tried to make it the remarkable part. The remarkable part was the 11 years. Garrett Miles had dismantled it in 91 days. He had been her CFO since year 4. She had hired him because he was meticulous and unsentimental and understood financial architecture the way a contractor understood load-bearing walls, meaning he understood which ones you couldn't remove without bringing the whole structure down. She had trusted him with everything, not because she was naive. She was not a naive person. She had trusted him because she had watched him work for 6 years, and he had never once given her a reason not to. The accident had given him his window. It happened on a Wednesday in November, the kind of overcast Portland morning that felt identical to the 40 mornings before it. She had been on her way to a board presentation when the delivery truck ran the light on Morrison Street. The chair she had been using before, the sleek, barely there model she'd been using for 4 years since the spinal injury that had rearranged her life at 34, was destroyed in the collision. She had woken up in a hospital room with a fractured collarbone, a hairline crack in her left wrist, and a new understanding of what the word setback actually meant at scale. She had been in the hospital for 9 days. Garrett had used all 9. By the time she was discharged, the corporate account structure had been quietly reorganized through a series of transfers that her legal team would later describe as technically legal in their execution and breathtaking in their cynicism. Garrett had not stolen money in the way that triggered immediate alarms. He had simply moved it, reclassified it, restructured the accounts in ways that pointed to a new entity, Miles Logistics Group, and left Callaway Systems holding liabilities it could not service and receivables it could not collect. By the time her attorneys identified the mechanism, the assets were unreachable, and the board, 3 of whom had quietly taken positions in Garrett's new firm, voted to place Callaway Systems in voluntary administration pending restructuring. The restructuring in this context meant absorption. Nora had fought it for 6 weeks from the spare bedroom of her house, which was itself now 3 months behind on its mortgage, because the salary she had always paid herself had been one of the first things reclassified. She had been on the phone with attorneys and financial forensics consultants and 2 different journalists who were interested in the story but not yet willing to run it. She had been in her wheelchair from 7 in the morning until midnight most days, pushing through the cognitive machinery of it, trying to find the lever that would reverse what Garrett had done. By the time the 3rd-month mark arrived, she had $3.47 in her personal account and a house that still technically bore her name and a company that no longer did. She had also, by this point, stopped opening the door. This was not a dramatic decision. It was not the kind of thing she articulated to herself as a policy. It was simply that the things that came through the door in that period were uniformly bad. Letters from the bank, notices from her hoe about a fence repair she couldn't fund, occasionally a neighbor who had read something somewhere and arrived with an expression of concern that was harder to manage than the letters, and so she had stopped answering it. The way you stopped answering a phone that only ever brought bad news. The brass door knocker rang 4 times before she counted them. Heavy, deliberate rings. She had inherited the knocker with the house, a thick lion head brass piece that had been bolted to the door long before she bought the place, and that she had always intended to replace with something more contemporary and never gotten around to. In the years since, it had become something she stopped noticing. Just part of the door. Part of the house. Hers in the way things were yours when you'd stopped really seeing them. She heard it ring 4 times and told herself it was the hoe again. She heard it ring a 5th time and decided to open the door. James Whitfield was standing on her front step with a clipboard and a work order for an evac unit that had been flagged by her home warranty company 3 weeks earlier, before the world had changed into its current shape. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing a gray work jacket with a company logo on the breast pocket that she didn't register. He had a tool bag over one shoulder and the particular expression of a person who had knocked 5 times and was beginning to recalculate whether anyone was home. When the door opened, he looked at her, then at the wheelchair, then back at her face with the same quick recalibration that most people made, and that she had spent 4 years reading in the first 2 seconds of meeting anyone new. But then something happened that did not usually happen. His expression settled, not into careful neutrality or reflexive over warmth, but into something ordinary, something functional. "Work order for a furnace inspection," he said. "The paperwork shows it was called in for the 22nd. Sorry it took this long to schedule." She almost told him to come back another time. She had no particular interest in having anyone in her house. But the morning had been very cold, she realized only now, because the furnace had been running irregularly for the past week, cycling on and off in a pattern that kept the house neither warm nor fully cold, just perpetually unsettled. "Come in," she said. He came in. He did not treat her house the way most service workers treated houses where a person in a wheelchair lived. He did not move things without asking. He did not speak loudly or reposition himself unnecessarily into her line of sight. He did the job, asked where the unit was, went to the utility room, opened the panel, began his assessment, and the sound of him working was a specific and oddly human sound in a house that had been very quiet for a long time. She went back to her desk. She had a document open on her laptop, part of the forensic financial report that one of her attorneys had sent over. She was trying to read it. She had been trying to read the same 6 pages for 4 days. The information was clear, but the meaning of it kept sliding sideways when she tried to apply it to anything actionable. She was staring at it when James Whitfield appeared in the doorway of her office. "Your heat exchanger is cracked," he said. "It should have been flagged before now. There's signs this has been an ongoing issue." He looked at the document on her screen without reading it. The repair itself is about 2 hours of work. "But you've been running carbon monoxide risk in here for at least a few weeks." She looked at him. "Has anyone in the house had headaches?" he asked. "Unusual fatigue?" She had attributed both to circumstance. "I need to order a part," he said. "I can be back Thursday to install it. Until then, I'd recommend keeping a window cracked in the main living spaces." He paused. "I can also crack one now before I leave, if that's easier." She told him the window in the kitchen was already slightly open. He said that was good, and it would be enough, and he would see her Thursday. Then he picked up his tool bag and he left. She sat at her desk for a moment after the door closed. The house was still cold. The document was still open on her screen, but something about the last 30 minutes had altered the texture of the morning in a way she could not immediately quantify. Not better, not warmer, just different, in the specific, marginal way that different sometimes was from nothing. She went back to the document. She could not read it. She tried. She had the page open, the cursor visible, the specific forensic language of the section she had been working through for 4 days sitting in front of her. She had been a person, for 11 years, who could read documents, who could move through dense financial analysis the way other people moved through light traffic, fluid, present, ahead of the next turn. It was one of the things she had been good at, one of the things she had relied on, in the years when other things were being taken from her, as evidence that the important capacities were still there. She had been 34 when the car accident happened. Not the one that put her in the wheelchair, that had been a different accident, a different chapter. A prior story that she had metabolized over 4 years and learned to carry at a sustainable weight. The second accident had been less physically catastrophic and more practically devastating. A collision on the interstate that had fractured her collarbone, cracked her wrist, and put her in a hospital for 9 days at the precise moment when Garrett Miles needed 9 days. She had been in physical therapy for 2 months before the accident. Not for the chair, for the collarbone. A hairline stress fracture she had been ignoring for 6 weeks that had finally required attention. She had been sitting in a waiting room in the PT clinic, reviewing a contract on her phone, when her attorney called to tell her what Garrett had done. The way she had found out was one of the things she still could not think about directly. Not because it was dramatic, because it was ordinary. An attorney voice. A professional reading of a legal situation. The words restructuring and transferred and voluntary administration arriving in sequence while she sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent light, wearing a sling she had not yet gotten used to. She had sat there for 11 minutes after the call ended. She had not moved. The other people in the waiting room had continued doing what they were doing, and the fluorescent light had continued operating, and the front desk had called 2 different names before she understood they were not her name. She was just sitting there with her phone in her lap and the specific knowledge that 11 years of work had been taken from her while she was in a hospital room not knowing it was being taken. That was the moment she kept returning to. Not the court filings or the frozen accounts or the $3.47. That moment. 11 minutes in a plastic chair. She put it on the shelf now. The way she put all the things she could not afford to carry but could not throw away. She went back to the document. The words made their shapes on the screen, and her eyes moved over them, and the meaning arrived at a delay. The way meaning arrived when the brain was too tired to process at full speed. She read 2 pages. She marked 2 passages. She wrote a 3-word note in the margin. Then she closed the laptop. She wheeled to the window. Outside, the Portland evening was doing the thing it did in winter. Not dramatic, not stormy, just dark, early, and cold without the courtesy of precipitation, which would at least have been weather. This was just the darkness coming at 4:30, and the houses across the street lit from inside. Warm light, people in their ordinary evenings, and the particular loneliness of observing ordinary things from outside them. She had observed ordinary things from outside them before. The wheelchair had made her practiced at the particular distance that assistive equipment imposed. Not because the equipment was the barrier, but because the world was not built for it, and the world's unbuiltness was a constant low-level tax on belonging. She had gotten very good at paying the tax. She had organized her life around it so efficiently that most days she didn't notice she was paying it. She noticed tonight. She gripped the door knocker as she passed it on the way back from the window. Both hands. The cold of the metal. The weight of it. She held it for a moment. She had not eaten since morning. She went to the kitchen and ate something she could not subsequently describe with any specificity, and went back to her desk and tried the document again. This time she got 3 pages. She stopped when she realized she had been reading the same sentence for 8 minutes. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about James Whitfield, which surprised her. Not that she thought about him, but how she thought about him, which was not as a service worker or a Saturday appointment or a variable in her current situation. She thought about the question he had asked about the headaches, the absence of performance in it, the way he had looked at her, in those 2 visits, with the same expression he probably gave to a load-bearing wall, measuring, present, interested in the actual thing, and not in what the thing was supposed to tell him about itself. She thought about the warranty card. She thought about the deferral program she had not known existed. She had a company with 214 employees and 12 years of operational complexity, and she had not known about a deferral program that was printed on the back of a standard warranty document. Not because she was unintelligent. Because she had been spending her intelligence elsewhere, on things that were larger and seemed more important. And the small things had accumulated into gaps she had not thought to look at. She had a feeling this was a category. She was too tired to follow the thought to wherever it was going. She went to sleep. In the morning, the document opened easily. She read 6 pages before 8:30. She could not stop thinking about the part where he had asked if anyone in the house had headaches. Not because it was a profound question. It was a standard diagnostic question. But he had asked it the way a person asked a question when they were actually interested in the answer. Not performing concern, just needing the information. She was not accustomed to that distinction mattering to her. She had spent 11 years in environments where everyone needed something from every question, and the information itself was rarely the point. Thursday came. He arrived at 8:15, which was earlier than the window he had given, and she almost didn't answer the door again, because the 8:15 had not been the agreed time, and she had become, in these past weeks, a person who found variance in the expected extremely difficult to manage. She opened the door. He said good morning and showed her the part, held it up, turned it once, explained what it was and why the old one had failed. She had not asked for this information. She suspected most people didn't. But he had offered it the way someone offered it when they assumed the person in front of them wanted to understand their own house. She found she did want to understand it. He worked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. She was at her desk for most of it, attempting the document again, failing at the document again, and listening to the sounds of someone who knew what they were doing, moving through a utility room, and not requiring anything from her. At some point, she made coffee. She did not know why she made 2 cups. It was reflexive. She had a habit. From years of working with people in her kitchen-turned-office during the Callaway system's early days, of making coffee for whoever was in the room. The habit had continued without occasion for months. This morning it had occasion. When he appeared in the doorway to tell her the unit was reinstalled and tested, and the CO levels were normal. She handed him the second cup without quite meeting his eyes and said she'd made too much. He took it. He said thank you in the tone of a person who understood the actual transaction and was not going to make more of it than it was. They stood in her kitchen for approximately 4 minutes. She told him, not because she had planned to, that the house was behind on its mortgage. She said it in the way that information sometimes came out of her when she was not managing herself carefully, flatly, factually, like reading something off a page. She was not asking for help. She did not know why she said it. He did not offer help. He said that home warranty claims could sometimes be submitted as part of a hardship deferral if the property was owner-occupied and the financial circumstances qualified, and that her warranty company had a specific department for this, and that it was worth a call. She had not known about the deferral program. She looked at him. He drank the coffee and looked back at her and said the number to call was usually on the back of the warranty card. She knew where the warranty card was. She had filed it. He set the cup down on the counter and said she had his number from the work order if anything came up with the unit. He picked up his tool bag. He said the heat should hold now, through the winter at least. He left. She called the warranty company that afternoon. She was on hold for 22 minutes. The deferral program existed. She qualified. The application took 11 minutes to complete. She sat at her desk after the call and tried to understand what had just changed, which was not very much. The mortgage was still behind. The company was still gone. The $3.47 in her account had not moved, and yet something felt fractionally less like a wall and fractionally more like a door. She didn't examine it. She went back to the document. But she did not throw away the filing. The deferral had not fixed anything large. The mortgage was still behind by more months than one deferred payment addressed. Her personal accounts, stripped of the Callaway system's salary that had been her livelihood for 11 years, ran on a thin operating budget that she had calculated to the week. She had stopped ordering from the restaurant 2 blocks away that she had used for dinner 3 nights a week since she moved into this house. She had stopped refilling prescriptions she didn't strictly need. She had started understanding, in a granular and new way, the specific mechanics of what it meant to have very little money when you had previously had enough not to think about it. She had grown up not thinking about it. Her parents had been professors, comfortable but not wealthy. She had taken loans for school and paid them off in year 3 of Callaway systems, and had never fully recovered the relationship with financial uncertainty that a person was supposed to maintain as a hedge against exactly this moment. She had been good with company money in the meticulous, structural way. Her personal finances she had treated as a variable that resolved itself, because for 11 years it had. It was not resolving itself now. She made a spreadsheet. She had always processed difficulty through structure. The spreadsheet told her, clearly and without opinion, that she could maintain the house for approximately 4 months if nothing additional went wrong. After 4 months, the decision about the house became the decision she was currently trying not to make. She put the spreadsheet in a folder and closed it. She had 4 months. 4 months was enough time for something to change. The legal proceedings were moving. Slowly, with the deliberate geological pace of the judicial system, but moving. She was not out of levers. She was out of immediate levers, which was a different problem. She went back to the document. She went back to the document every morning and she left it every afternoon, and she went back to it again, and in the evening she called her attorney and reported the day's findings, and her attorney said things that meant they were making progress without specifying what the progress was. Progress toward, and Nora listened and agreed and hung up and made whatever she was eating that week and went to bed. This was the shape of her days. The Saturdays were the shape of something else. She began to notice around the third Saturday that she was tracking the morning differently, not counting down to it. She was not a person who counted down to things, but she was aware of its approach in the week in a way that the other days were not aware of themselves. She thought about whether this was a problem and decided it was not, because the only alternative was not having the Saturdays, and the Saturdays were the only part of the week that had the particular quality she was struggling to name. Functionality, she decided, was not the right word. The Saturdays were functional. Yes, things were being repaired. The house was working better. The deferral application had been submitted and approved. But the functionality was not the quality she was tracking. It was something adjacent to it. The feeling of a room being in use and not requiring her to manage its being in use. She had been managing rooms for 11 years. She thought about this one morning while she was reading the document. She thought about the specific energy expenditure of being the person in a room who knew how the room was going to go, who made the room go that way through the quality of her presence, her decisions, her timing. She had been very good at it. She had run board meetings and investor presentations and team sessions and strategy offsites and 100 other kinds of rooms, and she had done all of them from a wheelchair, which was its own layer of management, managing her presence in a world built for standing, managing the assumptions people brought to the room before she opened her mouth, managing the recalibration that happened when she did. It was extraordinary how much of her energy she had not known she was spending on management until the room stopped requiring it. The room stopped requiring it on Saturdays. She thought about this for a long time. On the Saturday in early January, after James told her about Piper's nightmare, and she said that she was the first person who had asked, he was quiet for a moment in a way that was not uncomfortable. He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging since October, measuring, present, interested, and then he said something she had not expected. He said, "Your company. Callaway Systems. Tell me what it actually did." She looked at him. He said he had looked it up, the basics, and he understood the industry context. But he wanted to know what it actually did, in the way you knew something you had built. She told him. She had not talked about it in months, in the way she talked about it now, not as a legal matter, not as a forensic document, not as the thing that had been taken. She talked about it as the thing she had made, the algorithm, and why she had built it the way she built it, and what the gap was in the market that it addressed, and the specific problem she had been trying to solve when she was 23 and working from a desk in her graduate school apartment and could not get any of the existing logistics software to do what she could see needed to be done. He listened. He asked 3 questions, each of which was sharper than the last, and each of which, she noticed, pointed at a structural insight she had not expected him to have. He had been in houses for 10 years. He understood the gap between what a system said it could do and what it actually did when you put it in a real environment with a real person's specific constraints. She found herself answering his questions at length. They stayed in the kitchen for 90 minutes that Saturday. She thought about that conversation for the rest of the week, and the specific way you thought about a conversation that had operated as a mirror, showing you something about yourself that you could not see without the right angle. The right angle was someone asking about the thing you built without needing anything from the asking. She did not know how rare that was until she tried to remember the last time it had happened and could not. She went back to the document, but she didn't throw away his number. He came back on a Saturday. This was not part of the work order. The work order had been completed, the unit was running, and there was no professional reason for James Whitfield to be standing on her front step on a Saturday morning with a box of replacement weather stripping and the information, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, that he had noticed the front door frame had a gap in it that was going to cost her heat all winter, and that he had the materials from another job. She told him she hadn't called him back. He said he knew. He said he had also noticed that the deferral application he'd mentioned required a signed attestation from a licensed contractor stating that the property needed maintenance, and that if she'd sent in the application without one, it probably came back. It had come back. 3 days ago. She had put the letter on the pile. He held up the weather stripping. He said it would take 40 minutes, and it was the same kind he'd installed on the last 3 houses on this street when the neighborhood had a batch of bad door frames from the same construction year. She moved aside. He came in. That was how the Saturdays started, not by design, not by any conversation where a thing was agreed upon. He came on that Saturday, and the following week there was a gutter issue he had noticed from the street, and the week after that a water pressure problem in the bathroom that was connected to a valve she had not known existed, and at some point it was simply understood without being said, that James Whitfield would appear on Saturday mornings and there would be a thing wrong with her house that he would fix. She knew from the beginning what it was likely to look like from the outside. She did not care what it looked like from the outside. She was past the point of managing perceptions. The people who had opinions about her life were operating on information that was weeks out of date, and she had stopped carrying their expectations the way she had once carried them, like a list of standards she measured herself against on a daily basis. What she noticed instead was that the Saturdays had a different quality from the rest of her week. The rest of her week was the document, the attorneys, the calls that required her to speak carefully around the things she wanted to say and be precise about the things she needed to say, and manage the energy expenditure of every conversation so she had enough left over to do it again tomorrow. The rest of her week was the kind of grinding forward motion that looked, from outside, like nothing, because it produced no visible result and required everything. The Saturdays were different because James did not require managing. He was in her house, and he was working, and there was a human sound in the rooms, and occasionally they spoke, and occasionally they didn't, and neither required an adjustment from the other. She had not understood, before this period, how much of her social energy had always been spent in that adjustment, in reading what a room needed from her and providing it. She had been doing it so long she had stopped noticing it as an expenditure. She noticed its absence. He was not an easy person in the sense of being simple. He was direct in ways that occasionally landed harder than he seemed to intend. And when he had an opinion about something, he stated it as an opinion rather than as a feeling, which she found clarifying even when she disagreed with the opinion. He had clear and specific standards for work, for tools, for the way a thing ought to be done, and he held them without making them anyone else's problem, which was a quality she respected and did not often encounter. He also had, which she discovered in the 3rd week, a daughter. The mention of Piper came in sideways, the way his personal information always came in, embedded in something practical. He was explaining that he couldn't come the following Saturday because Piper's school had a thing, and she caught herself wondering what kind of thing, and then caught herself wondering, and said nothing. He came back the Saturday after. On a morning in early January, he arrived 20 minutes later than usual. This was unusual enough that she had noticed the 20 minutes before he knocked. When she opened the door, he had an expression she had not seen before. Not quite tired, not quite distracted, but carrying something that had not been there the previous weeks. He went to work on the bathroom ceiling vent, which had been on her list, and she went to her desk, and for an hour there was nothing but the sounds of the work. When he came to tell her the vent was done, she asked without planning to whether he was all right. He looked at her for a moment. Piper had a nightmare last night, he said, about her mom. It happens sometimes. She wakes up and she's confused, and it takes a while to settle her back down, and then once she's settled, I can't sleep. She looked at him. She's 4 years gone, he said. You'd think the nights would be easier by now. He set down the screwdriver. I don't say that to you as a complaint. I don't know why I said it. He turned back to pack his bag. Because I was the first person who asked, she said. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that she filed away without comment. Not gratitude. Something more like the recognition that happens when someone says an accurate thing out loud and you had not expected them to. He finished packing his bag. He said he would come back next week for the kitchen faucet. She said she would be here. He left. She stayed at her desk. She thought about Claire Whitfield, who she knew nothing about except that she had been gone for 4 years and that her absence still found her daughter in the middle of the night and her husband in the morning after. She thought about what it meant to carry that and still show up every Saturday morning with the right tools and the right information and the steady, unhurried attention of someone who was actually present in the room. She had known people who had suffered in the years of building Callaway systems, and she had observed that suffering often operated as a kind of credential. People referenced it, carried it forward as evidence of what they had survived and therefore deserved. James Whitfield did not carry his loss like a credential. He carried it the way you carried something heavy when you had been carrying it long enough, without the drama of it, but also without pretending the weight was not there. She found this more interesting than she had expected to find anything about him. The legal situation shifted in February in the wrong direction, and she found herself, on a Thursday afternoon that had started badly and gotten worse, unable to complete a sentence in the document she was working on. She had read the same paragraph 3 times, and it refused to mean anything. She was not sleeping well. She had not been sleeping well for weeks. The financial forensics were progressing, but the timeline to any outcome that resulted in actual recovery, rather than theoretical justice, was still measured in months she could not afford in the practical sense. She wheeled away from the desk. She wheeled to the window. Outside, the yard was bare. February in Portland was a sustained gray, not dramatic, just relentlessly without warmth. And the yard had the particular look of something that had given up, waiting for spring, but hadn't received the news that spring was coming anyway. She had not been outside in 11 days. She looked at the door, at the brass knocker she had never replaced. Heavy, lion-headed, bolted into the wood. She had sometimes, in the past few weeks, gripped it when she passed, not going anywhere, just gripping it, feeling the weight of it, the cold of it in the morning, the way the metal held the temperature of whatever the house was. She didn't know why she did this. She had simply started doing it. She gripped it now, both hands. The wheelchair stopped moving, and she held the knocker and looked at the street. That was when she noticed something. She did not notice it immediately in a way that registered as significant. It was small, a sensation in her right ankle, something that might have been the cold of the entryway floor or a pressure from the footrest of the chair. She shifted her weight slightly, the way she sometimes did when she had been in the same position too long, and felt it again. Not pain. Something different from pain. Something that had texture to it. She looked down at her right foot. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she wheeled back to her desk and opened the document and read the same paragraph a 4th time, and this time it meant something, and she did not know if those two things were connected. She did not mention the sensation to anyone. She was not, by temperament, a person who placed faith in single data points. You needed the pattern. You needed the repeat. A single anomalous reading could be anything. A position artifact? A cold floor? The specific way hope sometimes dressed itself as sensation when you were too tired to interrogate it. She was too careful to let herself run with it. But she also did not dismiss it entirely. She filed it. The way she filed everything that did not yet have a place, precisely, in the back of the thing she was building toward, which was still unclear in its shape, but was beginning to have edges. James came back the following Saturday for the kitchen faucet. The faucet took 45 minutes. They had coffee after. She had started making the 2 cups without thinking about it, and he had started accepting the second one without mentioning that he hadn't asked for it. This was the texture of the Saturdays now. He told her about a job he had done earlier in the week, a commercial HVAC install in a new medical building that had taken 3 days and required crawling through spaces that a person his size was not designed to crawl through. He told it the way he told most things, not dramatizing, just accurate. She found herself following the logistics of it more closely than she usually followed accounts of other people's work. She said she had been thinking about the financial structure of trades contractors, meaning what it cost to operate as an independent versus being absorbed by a larger service company. Because it was something that had come up in one of the forensic documents, and she had been thinking about the underlying mechanics of it. He looked at her. She said she wasn't asking about his business specifically. She was thinking about a model. He said, "What model?" She said she wasn't sure yet. She said it was the beginning of an idea, not an idea yet. He said those were usually the right time to describe them, before they got too fixed. She thought about that for a moment. She told him that Callaway Systems in its early years had worked with home health agencies on logistics solutions for medical supply delivery to homebound patients, that a significant portion of those patients had accessibility needs, that she had always thought there was a gap between what the logistics sector called accessible and what actually worked for someone in a wheelchair or using adaptive equipment in a house not built for them, that she had 13 years of understanding that gap from the inside. He was quiet. She said she did not know what to do with that understanding yet. He said it sounded like a company. She said she no longer had the capital to start a company. He said he wasn't talking about capital. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them elaborated. They finished the coffee, and he said he would come back next week for the interior door that wasn't latching, and she said she would be here. And he left. She stayed at the window after. The yard was still gray. The street was still gray. Portland in February was indifferent to the internal weather of the people inside the houses lining it. But something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not enough to name. Just enough to feel. In the same way she had felt the thing in her ankle last week. As a data point, filed, not yet a pattern. Not yet. Garrett Miles filed the injunction on a Tuesday. She found out from her attorney at 7:40 in the morning, which was still cold and dark and early enough that the news arrived without context. Just the facts of it landing in her phone screen while she was still in bed, which was the worst way to receive information about your own financial annihilation because you had not yet put on the armor the day usually required. The injunction was against her remaining personal assets, the house, the deferred mortgage, the last 2 accounts that had not yet been swept into the corporate restructuring. Garrett's legal team had argued that her ongoing attempts to pursue forensic recovery of the Callaway accounts constituted interference with the legitimate restructuring process, and a judge in Multnomah County had agreed. Temporarily, pending a full hearing in 6 weeks. Temporarily, 6 weeks. She sat with the phone on the bed and understood, with a clarity that required no analysis, that 6 weeks was not a temporary number. 6 weeks meant the forensic work stopped. 6 weeks meant the attorneys paused. 6 weeks meant Garrett had 6 weeks to finish absorbing what remained of Callaway Systems into Miles' logistics group before any counteraction could proceed, and by the time the hearing arrived, there might not be anything left to recover. This was not an accident. Garrett was methodical. She knew this because she had hired him for the quality and spent 6 years admiring it. He had waited until the injunction would land at a moment when she had the least remaining leverage, and he had been precise about the timing. She called her attorney. Her attorney said what she expected her to say, and what she also heard, beneath the professional confidence, was the other thing that attorneys communicated when they needed a client to stay functional. The acknowledgement that the news was bad, and that acknowledging it directly, was not within the scope of what they were paid to do. She had hired her attorney for her precision and her unflinching assessment of odds, and she had been right to value those qualities. And she was holding them against the attorney's voice now as she listened, and tried to decide whether the confidence was real or managed. She thought it was 60% real. She thanked her, said she would be in touch, and hung up. She did not open the forensic document. She had been trying to open it for 4 days, and the document and she were in a specific kind of standoff that she recognized from her worst periods in the Callaway Systems years, the moments when the thing you most needed to work with was the exact thing your mind refused to approach. She had learned in those years that forcing the approach never worked. You had to come at it sideways, You had to work on something adjacent until the thing itself became available. She worked on the mortgage paperwork. She had received 2 additional items from the bank that needed responses. She responded to them. She updated the spreadsheet. She made calls. She did the things that were adjacent. By 2 in the afternoon, she was in the document and reading clearly. The hearing was the following Monday. She worked through Sunday evening on the summary of the equity records argument, which her attorney had sent a framework for and which Nora was annotating. Her attorney was good at the legal mechanism. Nora knew the specific history, the Year 7 financing, the investors, the exact way the IP had been structured and why, the decisions she had made in those negotiations, and what they had been based on. Her knowledge was more specific than the legal framework, and she was annotating it as precisely as she could so that the specificity was available in the hearing room. She was annotating at 11:30 at night when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. 11:30 was not an hour for calls that contained useful information. It was an hour for calls that contained the other kind. She answered. It was James. He said he knew it was late. He said he had been thinking about the equity records argument since their conversation in February, and there was something he wanted to ask. She said, "Go ahead." He said. He was careful with the way he said it, she noticed. The deliberateness of his phrasing when he was making sure he was asking the right thing and not the adjacent thing. In the Year 7 round, the IP transfer was made from Nora personally to the company in exchange for equity. That was the standard structure. Her attorney had confirmed this in the earliest filings. She said yes. He said when Garrett restructured the accounts, the transfer he made to Miles Logistics was framed as a company-to-company asset transfer. The company's IP to his new company. But if the IP had originally been personally assigned, then the chain of title was broken somewhere, because you couldn't transfer personal IP through a corporate vehicle without a specific authorization at the personal level. She stopped annotating. She looked at what he had just said. She looked at it from several angles. He said he wasn't a lawyer. He said he was just someone who had spent 10 years dealing with property records and title chains and houses, and one of the things you learned in that work was that you could not transfer ownership of something from someone who did not have clear title to transfer it. She said, "You're describing a chain of title gap." He said he thought so. He said he might be wrong. She said she would call her attorney in the morning. She called her attorney at 7:45 in the morning. Her attorney was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was going to make another call. She called back at 9:15 to say that the chain of title gap was real, documented, and potentially dispositive, meaning it was not just additional evidence, but the kind of structural fault that made the entire Miles Logistics acquisition legally untenable at the foundational level. She sat at her desk with the phone. She said, "We have 1 week before the hearing." Her attorney said that was enough. She said, "It had better be." She called James after. She told him what the attorney had said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I should have seen that sooner." She said, "You saw it when you needed to." He said, "How are you?" She said, "I'm going to win this." He said, "Yes, you are." She said, "That's not something you can know." He said, "I can know it. I've been watching you work for 6 months." She sat with that. He said he would be there Saturday for the railing. She said she would be here. She put the phone down. Outside, March was arriving in Portland in the specific way Portland welcomes spring, tentatively, as though it had been burned before and was taking precautions. The trees on the street were not yet green, but they were also not what they had been in January. They were in between, which was its own kind of state, preparing without committing, building something they couldn't see yet, but that the direction of everything was pointing toward. She went back to the annotation. She annotated until midnight. The next morning, the document opened immediately, which was that the injunction was aggressive but had some merit, and that they would respond aggressively in return, and that the hearing in 6 weeks was not the end of the road. She said it with the particular brand of professional confidence that attorneys deployed when they needed a client to stay functional for the next 6 weeks. Nora stayed on the phone for 22 minutes. When she hung up, she wheeled to the desk. She could not open the forensic document. She tried. She sat at the desk and the cursor was on the file, and she did not click it. She looked out the window instead. The February morning had become a February afternoon, and the yard was still bare, and the street was doing the things streets did, moving, indifferent, occupied with itself. She called James. She had not intended to call him. She called him because he had answered the last time she had been sitting in the gray of this, and she did not have an explanation for why that was the call she made, only that it was. He picked up on the third ring. She could hear background noise. The van, probably, a radio at low volume. She told him about the injunction. She told it flatly, as she told most things, because flat was the register she used when she was not sure she could hold the other registers. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long do you have before the hearing?" She said 6 weeks. He said, "Is there a way to use 6 weeks that makes the hearing unnecessary?" She said she didn't understand the question. He said, "You know this man better than the attorney does. You hired him. You watched him work for 6 years. He was smart enough to do what he did. That means he was also careful enough to leave something you can use. What would he have been most careful about?" She thought about it. Not about what Garrett had done in those 91 days, which she had been thinking about for 3 months. About what Garrett, being Garrett, would have been most worried about. What kept a meticulous person awake at night. Not the crime. The evidence. The equity records, she said. She said it before she had fully finished the thought. Callaway Systems had gone through a financing round in year 7. The equity records from that round were in a separate filing structure that predated the financial systems Garrett had built, and that he had, as far as she knew, never touched, because the round had been fully subscribed and there had been no reason to revisit it. If the equity records were still in their original form, they would show the original ownership structure of the intellectual property, the logistics algorithms, the proprietary routing software, before Garrett's restructuring. And if the IP had been transferred to Miles' logistics group on the basis of a financial position that misrepresented the original ownership, the injunction would not save him. She hung up. She called her attorney back. She told her about the year 7 equity records. There was a silence on the line that had a different quality from the earlier silence. Her attorney said she would need to file for emergency document preservation before the injunction was fully served. She said she would make the call in the next hour. She made the call. By that evening, the preservation order had been filed. She sat at her desk in the dark. She had not noticed the light going out of the afternoon and then the room, and understood that what James had done was not give her the answer. He had asked her the question that made her find the answer in herself. She had been looking at her own knowledge of Garrett like a locked room for 3 months, applying other people's frameworks to it. Her attorney's frameworks, the forensic accountant's frameworks, and the lock had not opened. He had asked a question in the shape of her own intelligence, and the lock had opened. She did not know what to do with this. She thought about it for a long time in the dark room. About the kind of people who did that, who asked the right question and then stepped back, who trusted you to find the thing yourself rather than handing it to you with the instruction to use it. She had not had many of those people in 11 years of running a company. She had had advisors and board members and department heads and investors and the entire population of people who needed something from her intelligence and were willing to pay for it, but rarely trusted it without supervision. He had trusted it immediately. That was the thing she kept returning to. On a Thursday in the 3rd week of February, James brought Piper. He had not mentioned this in advance. He arrived with his tool bag and Piper beside him, small and very serious, wearing a yellow coat, and looking at the house with the particular attention of a child who had decided to form an opinion about it. He said the regular school day was a staff day, and that he had nowhere to put her, and that she was very well behaved and would stay in whatever room he assigned her, and would be no trouble whatsoever. He said all of this in the tone of a man who was only partially certain of the last claim. Nora looked at Piper. Piper looked back at her. Piper said the house was tall. It was a standard craftsman. It was not particularly tall. She said as much. Piper said it looked tall from outside. Nora said perhaps the trees made it look taller. Piper considered this with great seriousness. Then she said that was probably it. James assigned her the chair in the hallway with her backpack and her book. Nora wheeled back to her desk. For the first 20 minutes, she was aware of Piper in the hallway in the background noise way that she had been aware of James working in earlier months, present, but not requiring anything. Then Piper appeared in the doorway of her office. She did not come in. She stood at the doorway and looked at the room. She looked at Nora's desk, at the monitors, at the wheelchair. She looked at the brass door knocker, which was visible from the entry hallway beyond, the way a child looked at something that seemed heavy and interesting. She said, "Is that knocker really old?" Nora said she thought so. She said it had come with the house. Piper said it looked important. She said she didn't know if it was important. Piper said things that were old and heavy usually were important, because people kept them otherwise. Nora looked at her. Piper said her dad had an old wrench that had been her grandfather's, and he kept it even though he had newer wrenches and better wrenches, and that was how you knew it was important. Because of the keeping. Nora said that was interesting. Piper seemed satisfied with this and went back to the hallway. Nora sat at her desk. She looked at the door knocker from where she sat. It was visible through the entry, heavy, lion-headed, older than anything else in the house. She had looked at it every day for 4 years without thinking about it. She had gripped it in the bad mornings without knowing exactly why. She had just reached for it. The cold metal and the weight of it. The keeping. Piper came back at noon and asked, very politely, if it would be all right if she drew something. Nora said of course. Piper opened her backpack and took out a small pad of drawing paper and a set of colored pencils in a cloth case. She sat on the floor just inside the office doorway, cross-legged, with the kind of self-contained concentration that Nora had not seen from a child in a very long time, and she began to draw. Nora went back to the document. For the first time in 3 weeks, she read 6 pages without stopping. At some point, she looked up. Piper was still drawing, hadn't moved, didn't look up from the pad, just absorbed in it, present in the room without requiring anything from the room. James appeared in the doorway at 12:30. He looked at Piper on the floor. He looked at Nora. He had the expression of a man who had been prepared for an apology and was recalculating. He said the closet door was done and the bathroom latch was done, and he had looked at the back porch railing, and it needed to be replaced before spring. She said she would put it on the list. He looked at Piper again. She looked up briefly, showed him the drawing, the interior hallway, the brass knocker in the foreground, the door at the end, and then looked back down and kept going. He looked at Nora. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything about what was happening, which was the only way it could keep happening, and they both understood that without discussing it. He said he would come back Saturday for the railing assessment. She said she would be here. He said Piper was going to want to take the drawing home, but that he would ask if she wanted to leave it. Nora said she would like to have it if Piper was willing. Piper, without looking up from the pad, said she had been planning to leave it anyway. She finished it 10 minutes later. She gave it to Nora. In the drawing, the door knocker was enormous, taking up most of the frame, and the hallway behind it was deep and warm with a suggestion of light at the far end. Piper had drawn it in pencil and a single color, a warm brown that she had achieved by layering 2 of her pencils, and the heaviness of the knocker was absolutely right. Nora held the drawing. She said it was very good. Piper said she had been looking at it since she arrived. She said the heaviness was the interesting part. Nora looked at her. Piper said the knocker looked like something that held things together, like a hinge but on the outside. Nora said she thought that was exactly what it was. Piper went to get her coat. James and Nora were alone in the room for a moment. He looked at the drawing in her hands. She told him about the equity records and the preservation order, because she had not told him how that had ended, and he deserved to know how it had ended. She told him that her attorney believed it was enough to shift the hearing dynamics significantly, and that Garrett's position was weaker now than it had been a week ago. He nodded. She said she did not know what would have happened if he had not asked that question. He said she would have found it, maybe a week later. But she would have found it. She said she was not sure of that. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You built the company, Nora. Garrett took 11 years of your work and tried to use it against you. But he couldn't take what you know. He just needed you to remember you still knew it." This was the longest thing he had said to her in 4 months. She sat with it. He picked up his bag. He said Saturday for the railing. She said she would be here. He left with Piper, who paused at the door and looked at the brass knocker one more time on the way out. And then they were gone. Nora sat in the office in the silence they left, and looked at the drawing on her desk and understood something she had been not understanding for weeks. The injunction was the worst thing Garrett had done, and she was going to survive it. She was going to survive it not because of the equity records specifically, though the equity records were real and significant. She was going to survive it because she had spent 4 months in this house with a person who looked at her and saw not the chair, not the ruined CEO, not the woman who had been dismantled by someone she trusted, but just the person who had the information and needed to find the right door. The hearing was still 6 weeks away. She opened the document. She worked until midnight. The disclosure from the attorney came on a Monday, 9 days before the hearing. The equity records had been examined by a forensics team, and the examination had found exactly what she had suspected it would find: a transfer of IP ownership that was predicated on a financial position that could not be substantiated by any document that predated Garrett's restructuring. The transfer was, in the preliminary assessment of the forensics team, fraudulent. Her attorney called it significant. The word she used was actionable. Nora sat with the word for a long time. Then she called James and told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How do you feel?" She said she felt like the end of a very long line of things. He said that was probably right. She said she was going to need to decide, when this was over, what came next. Not what came next legally. What came next for her. She had spent 4 months surviving, and she was going to need to decide what the surviving was for. He said, "You told me about the gap. The accessibility logistics thing. You described it like it was already a company." Because it was. She had described it that way without meaning to, in February in her kitchen. And she had heard herself and put it on the shelf because she had not had the capacity for anything beyond immediate survival. She said that would require capital. He said it would require a co-founder first. She was quiet. He said he had been in her house for 4 months. He knew her work. He knew the gap she described because he had been navigating that gap in every house he worked in, the accessibility failures in standard construction, the mismatch between what people needed and what existed. He said he was not a tech person. He was a person who showed up and understood what actually didn't work. He said those were not the same thing, but they were both needed. She said she did not know what to say to that. He said he did not need her to say anything yet. He said the hearing was in 9 days, and she should put everything into that. She said he was right. He said Saturday he would start on the back porch railing because it needed to be done before the spring. She said she would be here. The setback had cracked Garrett's position rather than closing it. She could see the shape of what came next. Not clearly, not fully. But the edges were there, and the direction was there, and she was the kind of person who could work from edges and direction when she had to. She had been doing it her whole life. She had just forgotten, briefly, that she was still that person. The forgetting was over. The hearing was not the end. She had known it would not be the end, and it was not. What it was? A shift. A significant documentary on the record shift in the balance of the thing. The equity records held. The forensic testimony was clear. The judge did not rule immediately, but the tone of the hearing was distinct from the 6 weeks of legal pressure that had preceded it. Less like Nora was the person defending a position, and more like Garrett was. And she had watched enough legal processes in 11 years of corporate life to understand the difference. Her attorney called it a turning point. She called it the beginning of the end of the emergency. The emergency ending was not the same as things being fine. Her accounts were still frozen, the house was still in deferral, the company was still technically in administration. None of those things resolved because a hearing went well. But the nature of what she was doing had changed. Before the hearing, she was surviving. After it, she was building a case. The distinction mattered because building had direction. Surviving was just forward. She told James this on a Saturday in late March, in her kitchen, over the coffee she no longer made a point of pretending was an accident. He listened. He said that sounded right. She said she wanted to tell him about Vantage Mobility. She had been working on the model for 3 weeks, quietly, in the hours after the attorneys and before sleep. She had not shown it to anyone. She showed it to him now. He looked at the document on her laptop for a long time. He asked questions. The questions were not the questions of someone performing interest. They were the questions of someone who understood construction and installation, and the gap between what a spec said and what actually got built in a real house with a real person living in it. He had opinions about the model that she had not anticipated and that were better than what she had put there. By the end of the morning, the document was substantially different from the document she had shown him. He looked at it. He said it was real. She said she knew. He said they would need a name. She said she had already been thinking about Vantage Mobility. Because the point was the angle, seeing the accessibility problem from inside rather than from a compliance manual. He was quiet for a moment. He said that was good. He said he hadn't expected her to already have it. She said she had been carrying it. He said he had figured she probably had. On a Saturday in April, Piper came with him again. She came more often now. Not every week, but often enough that the chair in the hallway had become informally, without announcement, hers, her backpack, hung on the hook beside Nora's coat. Her drawing pencils were in the small cup near the entry that Nora had put there in March, and that Piper had accepted without comment. The way children accepted things that appeared in the right place, as though they had always been there. This morning, Piper came in and went directly to the drawing pencils, selected 3 colors with the deliberation of someone who had been thinking about this on the drive over, and settled into the hallway chair. Nora said good morning. Piper said good morning, and asked if Nora had seen any good birds lately. She said she had not been paying close attention to birds. Piper said that was okay. She said you couldn't see birds if you weren't looking for them, but once you started looking, they were everywhere, which was one of the things she had learned in her nature class, and which seemed to her to be true about more than birds. Nora looked at her. Piper was already drawing. She said she thought that was probably right. She wheeled back to her office. It was an ordinary Saturday morning. James was on the back porch. The railing repair had been done in March, and now he was assessing the porch boards, which were soft in 2 places and would need replacement before summer. She could hear the sounds of him working, the particular rhythm of it she had learned in 6 months, the intervals, the silence when he was looking at something and deciding, the specific sound of a measurement being confirmed. She was reading through the Vantage Mobility financials when Piper appeared in the office doorway. She did not stand in the doorway the way she sometimes did, as observation. She came in. She came in and stood beside Nora's desk and looked at the screen with the expression of someone who had not been invited but had decided to arrive anyway. She said, "What are you doing?" Nora said she was looking at a business plan. Piper said, "What kind of business?" She said, "One that helps people." Piper said, "How?" She paused. She thought about how to say it. She said she had not practiced this, she was saying it as it came, that some people live in houses that weren't built for them, not built for the way they move or reach or get from one room to another. And when you're in a house like that, you spend a lot of energy every day working around the things that don't fit. And the energy adds up, and sometimes it's so much energy just to do the ordinary things that there isn't much left over for the non-ordinary things. She said she was going to start a company that helped make houses work for the people inside them, so that the ordinary things took less energy and the rest of the energy was available. Piper was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Like your house." Nora said yes, like her house. Piper looked at the wheelchair. She said, "Does your house work for you?" Nora thought about this honestly. She said it worked better than it had 6 months ago. Piper said, "Because of my dad fixing things?" She said, "That was part of it." She said the other part was that she had learned, in the past 6 months, which things in the house were actually problems, and which things she had been working around without knowing she was working around them. Piper said, "That's like how I didn't notice how much I didn't like the cafeteria lights until I switched to a different table and then I couldn't go back to the old table because I knew." Nora said that was exactly it. Piper said, "You should put that in the business plan." She said, "The lights?" Piper said, "The not knowing until you know." Because lots of people don't know what they're working around. She looked at her. 7 years old. The clause she had been missing in the executive summary for 3 weeks. The reason why people would come to Vantage Mobility rather than waiting until something was obviously wrong You didn't know what you were working around until someone who had been working around it their whole life showed you. A 7-year-old had just articulated it in 30 seconds on a Saturday morning. Piper said, "Can I draw in here today?" Nora said yes. Piper got her pencils. She settled on the floor beside the desk, not in the hallway, in the office, and started drawing, and Nora went back to the business plan and put in the thing about the cafeteria lights, which was not about cafeteria lights. And the executive summary was suddenly something she would be willing to show an investor. James appeared in the office doorway at 10:30. He had the expression of a man who had come to report on porch boards and had arrived in the middle of something he hadn't expected. He looked at Piper on the floor. He looked at Nora at her desk. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said the porch boards were going to need about 6 of them replaced, and that he could do 4 in one morning if the weather held. She said that was fine. He looked at Piper again. She had not looked up from her drawing. He said he had been thinking about the logistics intake model in the Vantage plan, the part about how clients would describe their needs. He said most people who needed accessibility modifications didn't have the language for what they needed. They knew what wasn't working, but they described it in terms of their frustration, not the construction problem. He said the intake needed to be built for that, needed to be designed to translate the frustration into the problem. Because otherwise you were asking people to know things they didn't have the vocabulary for yet. She had been thinking about this but had not solved it. He said he had a system he used when he went into a new house for the first time. He asked different questions than most contractors asked. Not what's broken, but what's slower than it should be. What do you go around instead of through? What do you do on a good day that you can't do on a bad day? He said those questions got him the real information. She said she would like to build those questions into the intake. He said he would write them down. Piper looked up from the floor. She said, "I have questions too." James said you do not get to be on the intake team. Piper said she was just saying. Nora said she had good instincts and that James should probably listen to her. Piper said she knew. James looked at Nora with the expression she had learned in 6 months to read as something between exasperation and the kind of affection that didn't have a clean name yet. He went back to the porch. She went back to the executive summary. Piper drew. At lunch, Nora made sandwiches. She had not planned to make sandwiches for 3 people. She had been making sandwiches for 1 person for 4 months and had gotten efficient about it. But she made 3 without thinking about it, and Piper ate hers sitting at the kitchen table, which was where Piper had migrated from the hallway and from the office floor, which was its own kind of claiming. And James came in from the porch and ate his standing at the counter because he had sawdust on his jacket and didn't want to sit, and Nora ate hers at the table with Piper. Piper told them about her school project. She was supposed to make a presentation about something in the community that needed to change. She said she was going to do it about crosswalks, specifically the ones in their neighborhood that didn't have enough time before the light changed for kids or people who moved slowly. She had timed them. She had a chart. James said he had not known about the chart. Piper said she was still adding to it. Nora said that was a very specific and well-researched project choice. Piper said that was because she was serious about it. She said sometimes things didn't get fixed because no one had bothered to measure them, and so she was going to measure them. James and Nora looked at each other over the top of Piper's head. He looked like a man who was seeing something he already knew confirmed. She looked like a woman who was seeing something she hadn't known she needed confirmed, and now she could not unknow it. Piper said, "What?" James said nothing. He said she was going to be a problem when she grew up. Piper said she was going to be a solution. She said that was probably the same thing depending on who you were asking. Piper seemed satisfied with that and ate the rest of her sandwich. After they left, Piper had kissed Nora on the cheek on the way out without ceremony, the way she did things. With total absence of self-consciousness, Nora sat in the kitchen for a long time. She thought about the crosswalk chart, about someone who had decided that measuring things was the way to fix them. She thought about the drawing Piper had given her in February, which was on her desk now, next to the monitor, beside the brass door knocker detail that Piper had captured exactly right. The weight of it, the keeping. She thought about what it meant that a 7-year-old had walked into this house in the worst months of her life and not for a single moment looked at her like she was a tragedy. had looked at her instead like someone with good information and useful opinions and a house that was interesting to draw. She thought about James, about the question he had asked in February that unlocked the equity records, about the intake model he had built in his head from years of being in houses and being present enough to hear what people couldn't say, about the 6 months of Saturdays in which he had shown up with the right tools and the right questions and the specific, steady refusal to treat her damage as the most important thing about her. She sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then she opened the Vantage Mobility document. She wrote for 2 hours. The executive summary was now something she would not need to apologize for. The intake model was something she would not need to explain. The gap between compliance and function was articulated in language that was both precise and human. She would show it to James next Saturday. She thought, sitting with that there was something she wanted to say to him that was not about the company and that she did not have language for yet. This was unusual. She generally had language. She had spent 11 years in a world that required language, and she had been good at it. But this was different from what she had language for. It was older than language. It was more like the sensation she had felt in her ankle in February, standing in the entryway with both hands on the brass knocker, something that had no name yet, but had texture. And the texture was real. And she was not going to dismiss it. She was done dismissing real things because she didn't have a framework for them. She filed it. She would find the words. On a Thursday in April, she was working at her desk when she realized something she had been not quite noticing for several weeks, which was that the hours after James and Piper left were different from the hours before they arrived. Before, the house was quiet in the way that absence was quiet. After, the house was quiet in the way that presence recently departed was quiet. She was not good at identifying this distinction in real time. She only found it when she was sitting at her desk on a Thursday evening with the Vantage document open and something felt subtly, unhelpfully off. Not wrong, not worse. Just missing a texture that had been there on Saturday. She was not going to examine this closely. She understood that examining it closely was the thing she did when she wanted to understand something well enough to decide not to want it. She had a documented history of deciding not to want things. The most recent was the clearest. After the accident, after the spinal injury at 34, she had spent the first year allowing herself to grieve what she had lost. Not the walking exactly, though that too, but the specific life architecture she had built around a body that worked in a particular way. She had grieved it carefully, and then she had decided, with the same precision she brought to everything, that she would not want what she could not have. She would build something from what remained. She had built something remarkable from what remained. But the framework had held within it an assumption she had not examined, that grief, properly managed, resulted in the permanent elimination of the want. That if you went through the stages correctly and came out the other side functional and operational and capable of running an 11-year company from a wheelchair, you had also successfully closed the door on what you had lost. She had assumed the door was closed. She was beginning to understand it was not. The ankle sensation. The way her weight had settled differently last week, sitting in the kitchen with James after Piper had gone to the hallway chair. She had not said anything about it then. She had watched herself not say anything about it with the detached attention of someone watching a video of their own behavior, observing but not intervening. What was the intervention exactly? She did not know. She did not have a framework for a door she had told herself was closed and had now apparently found a crack in. She put the door on the shelf. She went back to the document. The following Saturday, Piper arrived with a question she had been saving. Nora could tell she had been saving it because Piper, who had a quality of asking things immediately when she thought of them, was unusually quiet for the first 20 minutes. She sat in her chair in the hallway with the pencils laid out in front of her in a specific order that Nora had learned meant she was organizing something. Not the pencils. Something internal. At 40 minutes in, she appeared in the office doorway. She said, "Can I ask you something about the wheelchair?" James's voice came from the back porch. "Piper." Piper said, "She's right there. I'll ask her directly." Nora said it was all right. Piper came in. She stood beside the desk. She had the focused, considering expression she wore when she was about to say something she had been thinking about for a while and wanted to get right. She said, "Do you miss walking?" Nora looked at her. She said yes. Piper said, "What do you miss most about it?" She had not expected the follow-up question. She sat with it honestly. She said, "The speed of it. Not running, just the particular efficiency of being on your feet, of moving through a space quickly without planning the route." She said when you were in a wheelchair, you were always thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead, accounting for the terrain, the doorways, the thresholds. She said it was not hard. She had been doing it for 4 years and it was not hard. But there was something she missed about moving through a space without that extra calculation. Piper was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is that why you hold the door knocker?" Nora looked at her. Piper said she had noticed. She said she had seen Nora grip it sometimes when she came in from outside, both hands, just holding it. She said it looked like it was helping with something. Nora said she was not sure what it was helping with. Piper said, "I think it's helping you hold still when something is changing." She looked at the 7-year-old beside her desk. She said she thought that was probably right. Piper said, "My dad does something like that when he's thinking about my mom. He holds his coffee cup, both hands, even after the coffee is cold. It's the same thing, I think." Nora did not say anything. Piper said, "It's okay to miss things." She said it the way children said things that were obvious to them and not yet obvious to you, simply, without ceremony. She said she knew. Piper said she just wanted to make sure. James appeared in the doorway a moment later. He looked at Piper, then at Nora. He had the expression she had learned to read as him having heard the last portion of the conversation without intending to. He said the porch boards were done and the railing was solid. She said good. He looked at her. She looked at him. Piper went back to the hallway and resumed drawing. He said, "She asks the hard questions." She said she had noticed. He said, "She asked me once why her mom had to die and I told her I didn't know, which was the first time I had told her something I didn't know instead of something I thought she needed to hear." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay," and went back to what she was doing, like not knowing was an acceptable state. Nora said it was. He said, "I know, but I had forgotten it was." She thought about that for the rest of the day, about what it was to have forgotten that not knowing was acceptable. She had been in that state for 4 months, not knowing how the legal case would resolve, not knowing whether 4 months of survival would produce something sustainable, not knowing what the ankle sensation meant or whether it would continue. She had been treating the not knowing as a temporary condition to be resolved as quickly as possible. Piper treated it as a state. Acceptable, holdable. She was going to have to learn from a 7-year-old how to hold an acceptable state. On a Thursday in April, she was working at her desk when she realized she had been in the same position for 2 hours without the usual low-grade complaint her lower back made about 2 hours in the same position. She moved, and the movement was, not better, precisely, but different. She sat up straighter than she usually could, without the effort it usually required. She stayed very still. She moved again, deliberately, weight shifted left. Weight shifted right. She had not been imagining the February sensation. She called Tanaka's number. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was the rehabilitation specialist her attorney had connected her with 3 months ago in the context of understanding her prognosis for the hearing. She had not pursued the consultation because she had not had the capacity to pursue the consultation. She called now. The appointment was the following Monday. She did not tell James. Not yet. She filed it. On Saturday, she showed him the Vantage mobility document. He read it for a long time. He said it was real. He had said it before, but he said it again, and it meant something different the second time, because the document was real now in a way the earlier version had not been. She said she wanted to formalize the co-founder conversation. He said he had been thinking about it. She said she knew. He said he needed to understand what she was actually asking, not the business, the other part. She was quiet. She said she did not fully have language for the other part yet. He looked at her for a moment. He said he was not going anywhere. She said she knew that. He said that was probably the right place to start. She said it probably was. She said she needed a little more time. He said he had time. And that was where it stood, not resolved, not named, but acknowledged, which was the most honest place they had been yet. The ruling came in May. She had been told by her attorney to expect it in the second or third week, but the legal system operated on its own calendar, and she had stopped trying to predict it. She had, in April, reached a kind of settlement with the waiting that was not peace exactly, but was functional. The understanding that the waiting was part of the process, and that the process was moving even when it didn't feel like moving. She spent the 3 weeks between the hearing and the ruling working on Vantage Mobility in the mornings, and working on the legal response materials in the afternoons, and sitting with James on Saturdays, either in the kitchen or on the porch where the new railing was solid and the boards were replaced, and the porch had the specific quality of something that had been correctly repaired, not new, not finished, but sound. She had started going outside. This was new. She had not been outside, in the early months, in any meaningful way, not outside as a daily practice. Not outside as something other than transit from one enclosed space to another. She had gone to legal appointments and to the PT consultation with Dr. Tanaka, and then come back. The yard had been irrelevant, the neighborhood largely invisible. In April, she started going out in the mornings. Not far. To the end of the block and back, sometimes to the small park 2 blocks east, sometimes just to the curb and back, which was shorter than it sounded if your route was full of the specific calculations of someone navigating a city that had not fully committed to accommodating you. But she went out. She reclaimed the neighborhood in the incremental way you reclaimed things that had been temporarily conceded to circumstance. On one of these mornings, she passed a crosswalk she had used 100 times before and noticed, for the first time, that the countdown timer was wrong. Not broken, it was counting down correctly. But the number was wrong. Not enough time. She knew this because she had been crossing it for 4 years, and she had calibrated her pace to the countdown, and it was always close. It was always, for her, a slight sprint to the end, which was not a sprint she could easily do. She timed it. She went home and sent a note to the city's traffic engineering department with the timing data and a clear, brief explanation of why the current setting was insufficient for anyone who moved at a different pace than the timer assumed. She did not expect a response. She got one in 6 days. They adjusted the timer. She wheeled past it the following Tuesday morning and watched the number, which was 3 seconds longer than before, and felt something that was not large and not named, but was there. She mentioned it to Piper the next Saturday. Piper said, "See?" She said, "What?" Piper said, "You have to measure it." Then they listened. She said she had told them without measuring it, and they had listened anyway. Piper said that was because she had told them the specific number. The specific number was the measurement. She said that was right. Piper said she had added the crosswalk to her chart. James, from the hallway, Piper, what chart? Piper said it was her community data chart. She said she was keeping track of things that needed to be fixed, and whether they got fixed and how long it took. James appeared in the doorway. Piper said she was being scientific about it. He looked at Nora. She said she thought it was a good project. He said, "Piper, this is not a job." Piper said it was not a job. It was a responsibility. She said her teacher had said that being a good citizen was a responsibility, and she was taking it seriously. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. He said he was going to check the bathroom exhaust fan. Piper said he was welcome. Nora did not quite hide a smile. He went to check the exhaust fan. On the Tuesday the ruling came in, Nora was at her desk. It came on a Tuesday, which was ordinary in the way that days containing irreversible changes were always ordinary on their surface. She was at her desk. Her coffee was still hot. The attorney called at 9:22 in the morning and read her the summary in the careful professional voice she had learned to hear through by now, listening not for the language, but for the structure beneath it. The structure beneath it said, Garrett Miles lost. Not partially, not conditionally. The judge had reviewed the equity records and the forensic testimony and the documentation of the transfer, and the finding was fraud. The fraudulent transfer was reversed. The restructuring was invalidated. Callaway Systems was restored to its pre-administration legal status, which meant the company was hers again, or the shell of it was, the legal entity, the accounts, the IP, and what she did with that was her decision. Garrett's position in Miles' logistics group would be subject to separate civil proceedings, which her attorney was already preparing. She held the phone after the call ended. She did not feel the way she had expected to feel. She had been expecting relief. She had also been expecting something adjacent to satisfaction. The specific satisfaction of a long and precise vindication arriving after everything it had cost. She felt those things, but underneath them was something quieter and stranger, not triumph, something more like the specific exhaustion that followed a very long sustained effort and the moment when the effort was allowed to stop. She put the phone down. She looked at the door, at the brass knocker visible from where she sat, heavy and old and still. She wheeled to it. She gripped it with both hands. Cold metal, the weight of it in her palms. She thought about the 9 days in the hospital, about Garrett's 91 days, about the morning she had looked at $3.47 and the morning a man with a clipboard had knocked 5 times. She stood up. She did not plan it. She had been to 2 sessions with Dr. Tanaka since April, and the sessions had been about establishing baselines and building careful groundwork, and Tanaka had been clear and unhurried and had said what she always said. The work is real, the progress is real, the timeline is the timeline, and it will not be rushed. She had agreed. She had not rushed it. But her hands were on the brass knocker, and the door was solid in front of her, and something that had been waking up in her since February understood that the solid thing was there and available, and so was she. She stood for 12 seconds. Her knees shook. Her weight was unevenly distributed, and her ankles were not fully reliable, and 12 seconds was not long. Not in any measure that mattered outside this entry hallway, outside this specific morning. She held the knocker and felt the floor under her feet with a clarity that stopped her breathing for most of the 12 seconds. Then she sat back down. She sat in the chair and looked at the door, and her hands were still on the knocker. 12 seconds. She called James. She said, "The ruling came." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "It went our way." He exhaled, a long, complete sound. She said, "I also stood up this morning." The silence was different this time. Longer. He said her name. Just her name. One syllable that carried everything he had not said in 6 months of Saturdays and bad Thursdays, in the company document they had built together, and the things that were not yet named. She said 12 seconds. He said, "Don't make a thing of it." She said, "I'm not making a thing of it." He said, "Yes, you are. Your voice is doing a thing." She said she was hanging up. He said he would be at the house at 6. She was there. He arrived at 6 with Piper, who announced upon entering that she had heard from her father that there was good news, and that she had brought a drawing she had done earlier in the week because she had been planning to give it to Nora anyway, and this seemed like a good day for it. The drawing was the front of the house. The porch, the door, the brass knocker centered and large in the frame. Piper had worked on it in color this time, warm browns and the gray-green of the porch boards and a wash of yellow at the edge that was the light from the entry. The knocker was the same as in the February drawing. Heavy, exact, the thing that held things together. Nora held it. Piper said she had been looking at it every time she came. She said she had noticed. Piper said it looked important. She said she thought it was. Piper said, "Did you know what it was before?" She said no. She said she had been looking at it for 4 years without knowing. Piper said that was probably normal. She said her teacher said sometimes you had to see something enough times before you could actually see it. Nora looked at the drawing. She said that was probably right. James was in the kitchen. She could hear him moving, putting something on the counter. The sound of him in her house that was familiar now, and the way that things you have earned the right to take for granted were familiar. Ordinary, present, hers. She went to the kitchen. He was making coffee. He did not turn around. She said, "Vantage Mobility is ready." He said he knew. She said, "I'm also ready for the other conversation." He turned around. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were in her kitchen in the house he had been repairing for 6 months, and the coffee was making the sound coffee made, and Piper was in the hallway doing what Piper did, which was look at everything carefully and decide which parts were worth drawing. She said, "I don't know how to do this. I haven't done this in a long time, and the last time I did it, the world was different and I was different, and I'm not sure the old framework applies." He said that was fine. She said, "I'm saying I want to try." He said, "I know." She said, "Without a guarantee." He said, "There's no such thing." She said, she knew. She said she was telling him anyway, so he understood that she understood that there was no such thing. He crossed the kitchen. He stood beside her chair. He reached down and took her hand, and she looked at their hands, and then she looked up at him, and what she saw in his face was not the careful warmth of someone managing the moment. It was simpler than that, plainer. The face of a person who had been in her house long enough to know what it looked like when the lights were on and when they weren't. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Piper appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at them. She looked at their hands. She had the expression she wore when she was deciding whether something required a comment. She said, "Finally." James said Piper. Piper said she had been noticing for a long time. Nora said she was not wrong. Piper said she knew. She said she had a system for noticing things. She said it was like the crosswalks, you had to measure them before anyone would listen. James said she was not measuring this. Piper said she was not measuring it. She said she had already finished measuring it. She went back to the hallway. Nora looked at James. James looked at Nora. Neither of them made a thing of it. The Vantage Mobility launch happened in September. Not a grand event, a small one. A room in a building downtown, 30 people. The kind of gathering where the work did the talking because the people in the room already understood what the work was. Accessibility consultants, home health agency contacts, 2 journalists who had written about the Callaway Systems case and wanted to know what came after, a handful of investors who had reached out after the ruling. Nora spoke for 14 minutes. She said the company had started as a conversation in a kitchen between a person who understood the gap from the inside and a person who understood the gap from the inside of the wall, and that those 2 vantage points were not the same and both were necessary and the name was not an accident. She said Vantage Mobility was built on the premise that most accessibility failures were not failures of intention. They were failures of information. People who designed houses didn't live in them the way the people who needed adaptations lived in them. The gap between what a code compliance form required and what a real person needed on a real Tuesday morning was the size of a life lived in the wrong house. She said they were going to close that gap, not through compliance, but through the intake, through the questions that got at what was slower than it should be, what you went around instead of through, what you did on a good day that you couldn't do on a bad one. James stood at the back of the room. Garrett was in civil proceedings that would take 2 more years to resolve and that she had placed in her attorney's hands so that she could stop carrying the weight of them. He would lose. She was confident of this, and she was confident of it not because she needed to watch it happen, but because the equity records were clear and the forensic testimony was clear, and the thing he had tried to take from her had been returned. She had put the case down. What she was carrying instead was this: the room, the people, the 14 minutes. When she finished, there was applause. Not the kind that filled the room, the kind that meant something specific had landed. She thanked the people who had come. She caught James's eye from across the room. He was not applauding. He was just there, standing at the back, with the expression she had been learning for 6 months, the one that was steady and present and took no credit for any of it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to the first investor who had approached and said what the company needed to say. After the event, after the conversations and the handshakes and the follow-up cards exchanged, they were the last 3 in the room: Nora, James, Piper, who had been allowed to come because she had been involved from the beginning and had made a chart about it. Piper said the speech was good. Nora said thank you. Piper said the part about the gap was the best part. James said she helped write that part. Piper said she knew. She said she was glad they had put it in. The room was quiet. Piper looked at the door. She said it didn't have a good knocker. Nora said no. It didn't. Piper said you couldn't really tell from the outside that something important was happening inside. James looked at Nora. Nora looked at Piper. She said she supposed not. Piper said that was probably okay, though. She said the important things didn't always announce themselves. She said they were just there, and then they kept being there, and eventually you couldn't imagine them not being there. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then James said they should probably go, because it was past Piper's bedtime. Piper said it was not past her bedtime. He said it was absolutely past her bedtime. Nora said she would see them Saturday. Piper said she would bring the chart. She said she would be here. They left. She stayed in the room for a moment alone. Then she wheeled out into the September evening, which was warm and specific, and the kind of night that did not know it was part of a story worth telling. She went home. The brass knocker was there when she arrived. Cold in the evening air, heavy, old. She gripped it as she entered. She stood for 21 seconds. Alone in her entryway, no one to count it, no one to report it to, no validation required. Just the floor under her feet, and the knocker in her hands, and the house that was hers again in the way houses were yours when you had earned the right to stay in them. 21 seconds. She sat down. She went inside. There is a version of this story that organizes itself around the ruling. In that version, Garrett is the villain, and the judge is the resolution, and the company's return is the point. That version is clean and logical, and it gets the facts right. But facts are not always the story. The story was a brass door knocker. It was $3.47, and a work order, and a man who knocked 5 times and did not leave. It was the specific quality of a presence that asked nothing of her except that she still be someone with useful knowledge and correct instincts and a problem worth solving. It was 6 months of Saturdays and a second cup of coffee that was never acknowledged, and a child who sat on the floor of her office and drew the hallway and said the knocker looked like something that held things together. What Nora Calloway had believed, in the 4 months before James Whitfield knocked on her door, was that the ruin was the defining thing. That what Garrett had done to the company was the permanent new shape of her circumstances, and that everything she did from that point forward would be measured against the loss rather than against anything she still had. This is a natural thing to believe when you are in it. It is also wrong. The ruin was not the defining thing. The defining thing was what she did with the door. She had almost not answered it. She had been in the house for weeks not answering things, because the things that came through the door were uniformly bad, and she had run out of the particular energy required to receive bad things without letting them change her. She was protecting what was left. That was reasonable. That was the math of a person who has been very damaged and is trying to keep the damage from spreading. What she did not know, in those weeks, was that something that was not bad was waiting on the other side. She could not have known. That is the thing worth understanding. She was not failing to see something obvious. She was not making a mistake that she should have caught. She was a person in a bad situation making the sensible calculation that things that arrived at the door were probably bad, because the evidence supported that conclusion. The evidence was wrong, or rather the evidence was accurate about the past and useless about the future. Evidence always is. James was not a rescue. She was not rescued. This is important to say precisely because the word rescue implies that the person being rescued was passive, was waiting, was unable. She was none of those things. She found the equity records. She filed the preservation order. She built the intake model and the executive summary, and the gap between compliance and function was her knowledge before it was anything else. She did the work. What James was a question, a presence, a refusal. He refused to treat her damage as the most interesting thing about her. He refused to wait until she was easier before he engaged her as a peer. He refused to fill her house with the particular kind of charity that looks like help and functions like diminishment. He showed up. He knocked 5 times and came in and asked the right question and left, and came back and asked another one. He brought tools and coffee and a 7-year-old who sat on her floor and drew what she saw. He did not save her. He did not rescue her. He simply refused to accept that she was only what the bad months had made her look like. That refusal, steady, undemonstrative, returned to every Saturday without announcement or credit, was the thing she had needed and could not have asked for because she had not known it was a thing that existed. 12 seconds in an entryway. 21 seconds on a September night. Not walking. Not yet. The timeline is the timeline, and it will not be rushed, and she is working it with the same intelligence she has brought to everything, which has always been considerable and has not diminished. But standing. 12 seconds, and then 21, and then the next one, whatever it is. This is not an ending. It does not have the clean shape of endings. It has the shape of things in progress. A company in its first year, a co-founder still learning the language of being a partner in more than one sense of the word. A child who brings charts and drawings and the specific, undefended attention of someone who has not yet learned to protect herself from what she sees. The brass knocker is still on the door. She kept it. That is how you know.